Welcome back to ESSA TV. Joining us today to discuss all things tennis are Stephanie Kovalchik and Karl Bialik. Stephanie Kovalchik serves as tennis data scientist at the Game Insight Group at Tennis Australia and as a researcher at the Institute of Sport, Exercise and Active Living at Victoria University. She runs a blog called Stats on the Tee, where she provides data-driven stories for men's and women's tennis. Karl Bialik serves as Yelp's data science editor. He was previously the lead news writer at 538 and a senior special writer for the Wall Street Journal. Stephanie and Karl are with us live now from Baltimore. Thank you both very much for joining us today.
Sure.
Out of frustration at the men's and women's official rankings, ELO rankings are often used to compare and rank tennis players, especially throughout time. What advantage do they have over official rankings? And what ranking system do you believe is the most accurate, whether it be traditional rankings, ELO, or something different?
Yeah, so I guess this is kind of under the topic of sort of measuring player strength or greatness. I know Karl and I have both done research on this, and I think, of the methods that are out there, you can really show that ELO does provide some improvement. So sort of an all-surface ELO provides about a 5% improvement over, let's say, like a logistic model that's based on the difference in players' official rankings. So one thing to keep in mind with that is that both methods do quite well if you're looking just among the top players. So generally, the top players, because of their consistency, they're there for a reason. Usually, their rankings are as good as ELO. It's more of an advantage when you talk about lower-ranked players. So if you have a match with players that are both outside of the top 30, you see a real advantage. So it actually provides a 15% improvement over official rankings in that setting. So that's really where the advantage is. I think another thing, though, to also recognize is that ELO, it's not just any one thing. It's really a method, and it has a number of tuning parameters. So I think there's still room to think about how even the version that has been put out there could be improved. And there are a number of ways, that we could consider including information that isn't reflected in sort of the standard version in tennis. So those are some of my thoughts on it. What do you think, Karl?
I am also a fan of ELO. I think it really depends what we're looking to do. So in the case of trying to predict a match as an analyst, or perhaps if you are inclined to wager on a match, to bet on a match, then you can improve on the official rankings. The rankings are there for the sport to be able to decide who gets into tournaments and how to seed players and how to set up a bracket that is fair and separates the top players. And for that purpose, the official rankings aren't too bad. I think ELO would improve on it, but you would have a trade-off. You would lose some of the sort of transparency and simplicity the understanding players have about defending points, about getting sort of a doubling of points or almost a doubling of points with advancing in each round. So there could be some middle ground if we were looking to replace the official ranking system. In the official rankings, you used to include bonus points for defeating top players, and that gets at the spirit of what ELO is trying to do. So if, for instance, that was reintroduced, and I think some players have even brought that up as a potential improvement to the system, that could be a way to capture some of the spirit of ELO while also keeping it to something that is understandable to the players, tournaments, and fans.
Match fixing is often cited as one of tennis's biggest problems, with many professional players, especially outside the top 300, financially insecure. In a recent ESSA article, I suggested redistributing prize money, especially in Grand Slams, to the early round and qualifying losers as a means of assisting vulnerable players and preventing match fixing. I also suggested the more radical idea of combining the two tours where possible, allowing players to benefit from increased prize money, exposure, and hospitality provisions. Are either of these feasible solutions to help improve players' financial security and curb match fixing? Instead, is there a better way to address these issues, or do you believe the Tennis Integrity Unit is currently doing enough to curb match fixing?
Yeah, so I think there are kind of two major issues that you're talking about there. So there's, on the one hand, I guess, greater distribution of the wealth that's currently in the system in tennis. And then the second issue is sort of how the income inequality that currently exists relates and contributes to match fixing. If we just talk about how we can try to resolve the income inequality that exists in the sport, I think just the redistribution of the wealth, let's say if we just look at the top at Grand Slams, it wouldn't really be enough because there's this targeting issue. So if you look at a number of the players that are just outside sort of the, let's call it the break-even point, so the players that are able to kind of sustain themselves by what they're making just based on their prize money earnings to cover the cost of travel, their staff, accommodation, and all of those things. There's really only about the top 150 players are able to do that. So if you look just outside of that group, those players are primarily playing on the challenger level, and maybe they're playing one Grand Slam event a year. So even if you're to put more money into the Grand Slams, it's not clear that it's really going to go to those players that are most in need. And then you've got a ton of other players that are in the system. So if you really think about, if we consider a player that's played at least one future event during the year to be a professional player, we're talking about thousands of players. So I think there's some need to reconsider, like, well, who are we really considering a professional player these days? And really it's at that lower level where the match fixing becomes more of a concern. So I think redistribution of the money that's already in the system isn't enough without addressing, like, how are you actually going to make sure that it's directed towards those players that have the best chance of really benefiting from it. We did a little bit of research on this, and it looks like at a minimum you would need about $4 million to push, let's see, that break-even point from 150 to 250. Let's just focusing on the men's game, let's say. But that's a minimum. That's supposing that you could directly allocate those funds to the players. But because of the nature of the tours, where so much is split among many players, particularly that group we're talking about, who aren't likely to advance very deep in the higher level events, it's harder to really make much of an impact, even if you're allocating a bunch of money at those earlier rounds. So you really would need something almost like, directing it, let's say, at the players that have the highest Challenger Tour rankings at the year end, or even being of like contractual types of arrangements with players, be a really radical change from the way that tennis goes about rewarding players. I think, like, in reality, those are kind of the only options that you would have to make a big impact. And the match fixing, I think, is really something that's at a lower level of the sport. So if you talk about, even if you move the line, of prize monies to where you have sustainable incomes for the top 200 or 300 players, that's probably still not the players that are most at risk to corruption in the sport. So in that sense, I think they're almost separate issues.
Yeah, I think you raised some really good ideas for improving tennis generally. Whether they would address match fixing specifically is tougher to say. So for instance, I'm in general in favor of uniting the sport more than it is now. I think uniting the men's and women's tours can only be a positive, can only grow the game. They're greater than the sum of their parts. And we already see that at the slams and at joint events. I'm not sure that would specifically address match fixing. And similarly with prize money, one thing that you could address, depending on how you target the money, is a related but really different problem, which is young, promising players simply not being able to afford to continue in the sport. That's the real risk. You want the overall talent pool to be as strong as possible. So there's a distinction, even if they might be at around the same level in the game and in the rankings, between a young player who's going to be rising rapidly, that could rise rapidly, and someone who's maybe already 30 and is just hanging around the game, but is not likely to break through into the top 100 or top 50. And you could improve the problem of potential young players dropping out and still have the problem of there are enough players hanging around the periphery of the game that's going to be really hard to take away the potential incentive for match fixing. So I think more on the kind of enforcement and prevention side than the incentive side is where you could really make gains. And that is going to be kind of dark arts that tennis is not going to talk about, because the more they talk about it, the more it'll be easy to defeat them. It seems like they're devoting more to it. It's difficult as outsiders to assess what it is, because naturally they won't tell us exactly what they're doing.
On the same theme, the International Tennis Federation, or ITF, recently conducted a player pathway review where they concluded, along the lines we were discussing before, that, quote, there are too many players trying to compete on the professional circuit, too few players are breaking even, and the age of these players is increasing, unquote. In response to this survey, the ITF is creating a new global transition tour in 2019. Can you run through the ITF's proposed new transition tour and what effect it could have on tennis, both in helping players financially and in helping junior players break through at a higher level?
Yeah, so I think what this initiative is going to do in 2019 is to effectively split the current tour structure, which consists of a tour level ATP WTA and then an ITF level, into actually 3 separate tours. So you'll have your pro level tour, and then you'll have this development tour, and then we'll have the junior circuit. So the ITF will be the maintainers of this, what they're calling a sort of transition tour, and the junior tour. And that transition tour will consist of effectively what's now future level events, so sort of 15K tournaments. And I think the most direct implication of that will be that it's really redefining what a professional tennis player is. And what they're trying to do is to target the pro level, tour level events to the top 750 ranked players, and everybody else would be allocated to this transition tour, no matter your age, actually. So that will affect where players can compete. So it is the case, I think it'll have very little impact on the top 250 players, but below that, actually, a lot of those players do actually compete in the futures level right now. So some of them are going to be forced to play up. So it'll have some impact on the play activities there. And I mean, whether it will help development of players or not is, I think, less clear.
Yeah, I think it does potentially address one of the inconsistencies in the current system, which is that tournaments that are technically at the same level can have very different strengths, and players can get into tournaments in one place because its time on the calendar or its location or the sort of support and facilities around it differ, and kind of exploit the inefficiencies in the system. So creating a kind of cutoff is one way certainly to address it, but I agree that sort of the bigger implications of it remain to be seen, and you could find other sort of loopholes anyway. And there's always, once you create a cutoff, it'll always be arbitrary where that cutoff is. I think there's some logic to the one they chose, but it could have been a different one too.
The Davis and Fed Cups are struggling in recent times, with top players opting out, especially after they've won the Cup once. New models have been proposed for the Cups, including reducing men's singles matches to best of 3 sets and playing the Davis and Fed Cup finals together on one weekend. The ITF is currently in the process of implementing these changes. However, they have not received overwhelming support from players. Do you believe that changes are necessary to reinvigorate the Davis and Fed Cups, both from a financial and a prestige point of view?
It really depends what the goal of the tournaments is. I think there are already goals that are clearly being achieved no matter who is competing, or at least competing every year. It's leading to high level, if not very top level events being hosted around the world in countries that might otherwise not host professional tennis. It generates enormous enthusiasm at those events, a kind of partisanship and excitement that's not experienced elsewhere. And it clearly, for the players who do commit to it, affects them in a way as a team and national event that other tournaments and events don't. And there is potential to lose some of that with these changes. If the goal is to try to restore it to the full extent of its former glory, especially the Davis Cup, which, given the sort of uneven gender history of the sport has a longer and maybe more prestigious history, ever replicating the experience of it being basically the highest level in the men's game and the ultimate goal where players would skip Grand Slams because it would jeopardize their country's chance at Davis Cup. I think that's just not going to happen no matter what you do. So I hope that there are more realistic goals they're trying to achieve. If it's just increasing the percentage of the time that top 10 players participate, and especially in the early rounds, because sometimes they'll drop in later sort of playoffs to remain at the high level because they won't be challenged by other top players. So that kind of doesn't count, or it doesn't count the same way. If they do manage to increase the participation of those players in the rounds where it counts, in the knockout stages, then that's a great accomplishment. I think it is telling that players haven't been terribly supportive. I think the best of three thing is especially interesting in that it goes to show that the difference in format really isn't that important. I think it's something both Stephanie and I have looked at. And once you're committing to that being a weekend and really a whole week that you're playing for your country, and the travel involved and all the press events and other events and the practices and sitting on the bench during matches, the difference of potentially 40 minutes to an hour in the actual match play isn't really such a great one. So I think of the things they could have tinkered with, that may have been not the best return on investment they might have gotten in terms of the cost to the tradition and legacy versus the potential benefit. But on the other hand, I think experimentation is good, and if they can find ways where it still feels like Davis Cup and Fed Cup, which it probably wouldn't if it were every 4 years or one weekend, if it can still feel like there's some continuity and yet they're changing it and see what happens and they're willing to measure that and iterate on that, then I think they're doing the right thing.
I just think the match format change, it's from that alone, it's really not clear what the objective is. It seems like maybe trying to demonstrate that they're open to making some change without it being too radical. I don't think it's going to change, the representation of top players at the event, because that's more of a scheduling issue, which the match format doesn't address. It's kind of unclear that those changes alone are really going to have any impact in terms of the popularity of the sport. But again, whether it's meeting the objectives that Davis Cup has is unclear, because it's not, really clear what they're trying to achieve.
I do like the idea of a combined Fed Cup, Davis Cup to the extent they can. On the other hand, one of the things that makes both events really special is that home atmosphere. And unless you happen to have the same country in the final of both, it's not clear how you preserve the home atmosphere while using the same venue. So I think there are so many trade-offs with changing both events, and that's one of the reasons it's taken so long to get to this point. And I think it could take a while to really settle on something that addresses their concerns without losing what's special about it.
On that note, would you have preferred other changes to have been introduced, such as requiring players to play 2 of the opening 3 rounds if they want to play the final, or even other changes?
I like that idea. I think that's an interesting one. I think there have been talks about if you win, you get a bye, maybe for the first or even the second stage. I think there's some merit to that. We've seen a few times where defending champ doesn't have its top players in that first weekend, and there's something sort of deflating to the competition about having the defending champ ousted in the first round, not because of a great upset, but because they're fielding their B team. So I think there's some merit to that. I think you could probably get away with having more buys or even dropping around from the competition and not necessarily losing that much. Going all the way to, let's say, having it all unfold over 1 week would really be tough, and you would certainly lose that home venue nature of it. So, I mean, every time it would be more like an Olympic kind of event. Yeah, and the Olympics already happens now in tennis, and I don't see the merit to sort of replicating it the other 3 years in between. It is. You could also, I think, make a case maybe for not holding it in Olympic years and having that be a break, because I think especially in Olympic years it can feel more like an afterthought. But these are also like my personal biases coming through, and everyone has different takes on it, which is why this is so hard.
Tennis is a sport that engages and captivates the public during the Grand Slams, but largely fails to do so outside of these events, in contrast to team sports, which are followed week in, week out over a season. There may be several reasons for this. One might be tennis's long season compared to other sports, which lasts for 11 months, or 12 if you count the International Tennis Premier League. Another reason could be the accessibility of tennis on TV. A sports team is usually broadcast by the same broadcaster each week. Here in Australia, apart from the tournaments held here in January, the only other tennis on free TV is Wimbledon and the Davis and Fed Cups. Some tennis is broadcast via Fox Sports, including the slams apart from the Aussie Open, some via ESPN, some via beIN Sports, and some only via Tennis TV and the new WTA TV. This can make it quite hard for fans to track their favourite players throughout the year. Are either of these factors, season length or broadcasting, behind the lack of regular public interest in tennis, or are other reasons to blame?
I mean, I think you definitely have to look to something like professional golf, for example, as a good kind of comparison for fan interest, because they have sort of the same inherent challenges in the sense that, you know, they're individual sports, players are traveling all throughout the season, seasons are long. So tennis should certainly be meeting, you know, at a minimum, the same sort of fan audience as we would see in golf. And if they're not, then you definitely have to look to the nature of the distribution of the events to see, you know, the problem there. So I think, I don't think the season length should be an issue, because there's certainly a number of sports that have long seasons and still retain high popularity even throughout the globe. I think the fractured nature of the distribution has got to be the major factor. At the same time, you know, I think there are probably other maybe small contributors to that you didn't point out, Nick. So you and I both being in Australia most of the year, we know that time zone is a factor. So just the nature of all of the travel that happens with the different events has got to be kind of a setback. Because, you know, you want to see these events live. Like they don't have the same interest if you're seeing it on replay and have to avoid the news and things. So that has to be a factor, but definitely the state of the availability and the distribution of the events is, I think, a massive problem for the sport.
And I've had some concerns, not as much with the length of the calendar as with the details of it. So specifically for the slam that happens in your country, there isn't a top-level event. There is on the women's side, but on the men's side, there isn't a top-level event leading up to the tournament. After the tournament, there are two-week events that have each at times considered themselves and been called by others the fifth slam in the U.S., in Indian Wells and Miami. And they're often played on surfaces that are similar to the Australian Open, but they're after the Australian Open. It's a month of the tennis season, and they're not leading up to anything. I mean, after them, there's the clay season, which really has nothing to do with them. So they're not leading up to a slam. And I think if there was more coherence for some of the slams, where there is that buildup, then I think it would work better. So you do have, I think in Europe, a real awareness of the clay events leading up to the French Open, because there's a story there. There are small events, then there are Masters and Premier level events in Rome and Madrid, and then you have the French Open, and what happened in those events tells you so much about players' form on clay. It tells you, okay, they're seeking revenge, or they met in the semis, they might meet again in the final. What did we learn from that matchup? And in Australia, you really just have a couple of weeks, and especially on the men's side, lower level events. The U.S. Open has a good lead-in as well. Wimbledon really doesn't, in that there are no top-level men's or women's events on grass leading up to Wimbledon. So it's such a tradition-bound sport, and we talked about that with Fed Cup and Davis Cup, and I think it applies here too. And I think that gets in the way of building more interest throughout the year. I agree with the factors Stephanie raised, but I really agree with the division within the sport. I mean, I certainly experienced firsthand, okay, I have a tennis TV subscription, but that doesn't get me any women's events anymore. And it certainly doesn't get me Davis Cup or Fed Cup or slams. And just trying to pay for all of that and keep track of all of that and switch between different apps, it's, even if you're willing to watch on replay, it's difficult and expensive and daunting. And yet another reason that I'm all in favor of the sport coming together more than it has.
Yeah, I think, Carl, all what you're talking about there is being able to build a narrative, how important that is to getting that kind of year-round engagement. And it seems like right now, like the two major barriers to that are, you know, the fractured distribution and in some choices and actually how the tour events are scheduled.
Yeah, and I think this is a sort of smaller factor, but I think is the way it plays out for some fans. When you listen to broadcasters comment during Grand Slams, because it's a different network and a different set of talent calling matches, they haven't seen the matches. They haven't really focused on those tournaments. Some of them are such big fans and just tennis experts that they have, but it's not something they were obligated to do. That was part of their job that they necessarily did. They probably weren't there even if they were watching. So you missed out on that level of kind of continuation. Whereas if you tuned in to the Australian Open and it did follow Indian Wells in Miami and the local broadcasters had been there and interviewed the players and watched the matches and were talking about it constantly, someone who was really into the tournament, right, realized, hey, I'm joining this story 2/3 of the way through. I'm picking up this book on page 400. Next year, I'm really going to tune in. So I think there's some real potential there to have not just the players with continuity, but everything else surrounding the sport that creates the full experience for fans.
Stephanie, in a 2016 article, you proclaimed that tennis had entered the big leagues of sports analytics with the publication and award recognition of a paper entitled The Thin Edge of the Wedge. Can you explain this paper and its potential effect on tennis in further detail, along with how data in general could have a major effect on tennis into the future in areas such as research and journalism?
Yeah, so this was a paper that appeared at the MIT Sloan conference, which, is one of the biggest sort of venues for advances in sports statistics. And I think it was a real first instance that we have seen, some new methods using the tracking data that's now available in tennis. So the tracking data is where we have information about the location of the ball and the location of the players throughout the course of the match. Systems like the Hawkeye system that are the maintainers of the player challenge system are able to collect this information throughout the course of the match. So this paper, which is actually the lead author on that was Felix Way, who was a student at the Queensland University of Technology, and was working with Pat Lucy, and they're both now at Stats Inc., doing more sports work, and they were working with the director of our group at Tennis Australia, Makar Reed, who leads our Game Insight group. So together they put together, it's essentially a shot prediction method to use the tracking data to say, based on the physical characteristics of a shot, the context in which it was done, and the playing styles of the two players involved, to say how likely it was that that shot was going to end the point as a winner. So there are, I think, two main things that really come out of that. So the one is, as inputs, they're characterizing playing style based on these data descriptions at the shot level, which is really exciting because normally we've been kind of restricted to these very qualitative ways of looking at shots. We've got volleys, a backhand slice. Normally we're just really considering kind of handedness and spin at most. So that's quite limited. With the tracking data, we can take into much more into account. We have a whole kind of shape of the shot, the speed it's moving at, the location of where it's hit from and where it lands, all of these things. So it was the first example of really thinking of almost like a vocabulary of shots in this data-driven way. And then it used that as inputs into this prediction model. And the prediction model is exciting because you can imagine that leading to a whole set of new metrics of evaluating sort of the quality of shots, whether players are making the right decisions in certain situations, and that could be layered in to broadcast and make sort of the experience of matches more interesting, as well as leading to a whole new direction of research. So it's coaching. Yes, helping the coaches if they're open to these things. Some are now, and not all, but I think more and more, they're going to see the value when you have these kinds of, tools in a way coming out of the data. And it really just means, looking at these data more as a service for player challenges and actually as a basis for actually understanding the way that the sport is played better.
And I think it's incredibly exciting because I think you hear so often people say that they'll use different cutoffs, but let's say anyone in the top 300, top 100 has pretty much all the tools you need. There will be differences in how good their serve is and backhand and movement, but generally they have the tools. And what sets them apart, you'll often hear, is like grace under pressure or clutch. But I think what a lot of that comes down to is decision making. It's, I have all these tools, which one am I going to use in which way on each shot? And some of that, I'm sure, is instinctive, but to the extent that you can dig into these shot vocabularies and figure out what in different situations is a more effective choice, while taking into account somehow all the complexities of it depending on the surface and opponent and weather and everything else. But if there's an overwhelming, it turns out, advantage to doing one thing over another in a certain situation, it really could help with improving players. And then, as Stephanie said, that will depend on the openness of players and coaches to that kind of analysis. But I think they do appreciate the value of decision making. So I think in those terms, they would like to know, oh, you often do hit the drop shot from there. You should never hit the drop shot from there. I think that would be useful, and that a lot of players would be open to it.
So it could lead to high quality tennis as we go into the future as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think in all sports there can be a tension between what is the best tactical move and what is the highest quality and entertainment. I think as an analytical tennis watcher, the best decision is the one I want to see. But then again, there's some spectacular shots that players probably shouldn't hit. Sometimes players hit tweeners when another shot would do. So I think because it is an individual sport and they're not going to let down a team, I guess in doubles you could let down your partner, but they're certainly not letting down 20 people and a larger business entity. Some people will still make different decisions, but for those who are trying to optimize for winning on every decision they make, I think that leads to better tennis because you are then deciding it based on who's executing better and not someone who has all the shots but loses because they're making bad decisions. That's not really fun to watch.
Carl, in 2015 and 2016 respectively, you wrote articles titled Rafael Nadal is 80% of what he used to be and Roger Federer's tough path to winning another major just got tougher. Despite seeming perfectly reasonable at the time, since their respective publication, Nadal has won the French Open, 3 Masters tournaments and made the final of the Australian Open. Remarkably, Federer has gone on to win the Australian Open and Wimbledon, along with the 2 Masters tournaments we were discussing before in Indian Wells and Miami. Is their late career resurgence unprecedented across both past men's and women's tennis? Or as you suggested in a recent article, Stephanie, is 2017 Federer not far removed from his 2015 self?
I guess it's a question for both of us, but since you started with me, I'll go first. I appreciate that given the build-up to the question part of the question, you didn't say, Carl, are you just really bad at analyzing tennis, which would have been fair given those 2 headlines. I think it is unprecedented, although everything about Federer and Nadal is unprecedented. This is another thing that's unprecedented. They are both now the 2 leading all-time slam winners, but it's more than that. I mean, there are so many records that they hold, and they hold them even though for much of the time that they've been near the top, they've been contending with another one of the very best, if not the best, Novak Djokovic and Andy Murray, who is almost certainly one of the 10 best tennis players ever. It's just that he's had to play against these 3, so he only has 3 slams instead of maybe 8 or 9. In terms of specifically what I wrote there, I think Nadal was about 80% of himself in 2015. I think it's remarkable that he's gotten back to maybe his best or better this year, and pretty unexpected, even though he's 4 years younger than Federer, almost 5 actually. It just seemed like the trajectory he was on was one we were familiar with in previous eras of late 20s, going into your 30s, having sustained a lot of injuries, having a very tough physical style that you are declining and you're not going to have a resurgence. He did miss time here and there, and that's something he has in common with Federer now. Federer hadn't really missed much time, his 6 months at the end of last year. And I still think at that moment, the most accurate thing you could say is that his path had gotten tougher. I think people wouldn't be marveling as they are now about his 2017 if it didn't look so unlikely last year. Not only unlikely that he would win two titles, which I think no one would predict, but that he would even be so close to winning all these big titles, the 2 majors and the 2 masters. And I think what he's doing is more unprecedented because he is almost 5 years older. But when players are asked about him, they say, he's Roger Federer. Everything about him is unprecedented. we shouldn't be surprised when he adds another unprecedented to his resume. I'd also point out that I wrote both those articles for 538, my previous employer, and we were writing about other things not having to do with sports that were unlikely to happen, but there's still always a chance, and I think we always leave that chance open. And something that only had a 30% chance of happening last November in the U.S. in our politics happened. So in that sense, something that was probably even less likely, Federer winning 2 slams this year, should not shock us, because there are lots of sports we watch and lots of things that we don't expect that will come to pass. And again, when we're talking about Federer and Nadal, lots of things happen. I will quickly say before Stephanie answers, I do also think she's right. And I read the story, I think it's pretty persuasive. There are probably things Federer's doing better than 2015, some things he's doing worse. But he was really good in 2015. And I think, as she wrote in that story, the fact that he's still doing really well at 2017, even if he's only at that same level, is itself incredible, because what he was doing at 33 going on 34 in 2015 was almost unprecedented at that age. And normally you'd expect a big drop-off, especially if there's a 6-month gap in between. So for him to be back to that level after 6 months off and taking advantage perhaps of a weaker field is remarkable.
Yeah, I guess, the article, I think, that I wrote was really motivated from this just sense of, the discussion this year about some kind of great reinvention that we're seeing in Federer and Nadal. And I just wanted to maybe push back on that a bit, because I feel like really what's impressive is their ability to sort of maintain the level at this point in their careers. And I think, what we're seeing is that consistency in such a later stages of their careers coincided with what looks like it could be, this kind of end of a cycle on the men's tour. So, you do see these periods that seem to have come during the Open era about every 10 years, where, players that had been dominant for a time, they're having their last titles, and then you see a new group rise. I mean, you can think back, that's 2003, right? The same year Agassi has his last slam, which was also sort of renaissance for him, and you see Roger Federer get his first, right? So you have these kind of changes of a guard happening. Now we're still waiting for the new slam titleist to come, so I guess I can't really be sure until that happens. Maybe we'll see that at the US Open. But so I'm still waiting, right, to be convinced of whether or not this is something that's completely unprecedented, or if we're just seeing maybe we're in the middle of a transition. But definitely, I think, the age at which this is happening for Federer and Nadal, and just the extent of their accomplishments in their careers that are still ongoing, is really impressive, and nothing that the sport's really ever seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think 2015 is such an interesting year to look back on, because that could have been the peak of Djokovic and Murray in a way.
That's what we were expecting this year, right?
Yeah.
At the start of the year, it was supposed to be the Novak and Andy battle.
And maybe that was really 2015, 2016. And Djokovic in 2015 won 3 majors, made the final of the 4th, won, I don't remember how many, maybe 6 Masters, was in the final of almost every tournament he played. He won the World Tour finals. It was one of the best years of all time. Murray made the semis in French Open and Wimbledon. He made, and then lost to Djokovic and then Federer, possibly the best on those surfaces that year, made the final at the Australian. Rafa was certainly not himself. I stand by the 80% of himself. That was really an off year. But for Federer to make 2 slam finals and have the year he did, and he won Cincinnati, and I think he made the final in Rome. He really was good throughout the year. Made the final in Indian Wells. Was maybe just as big of an accomplishment as this year. It's just that this year Djokovic and Murray have seemed to start to follow the typical aging pattern. They turned 30 this year, and for most of tennis history, that would be past your prime. So maybe what they're doing is normal, but because Federer and Nadal have kept sort of defying the odds, it seems strange that Djokovic and Murray are declining. But with their decline, this is a sort of off year, like Stephanie said, and there certainly isn't anyone, even let alone a young 20s like Federer and Roddick were in 2003 when they broke through, or Leighton Hewitt, where he had already broken through, forget about the young 20s. We don't even have like mid-20s players breaking through. So it's this weird thing where Federer and Nadal can kind of pad their stats and add some titles, whether they're at their best or not quite, because that's how good they are. That even if they dropped off a bit, they're still so much better than the rest.
And on that note of players emerging and a kind of changing of the guard, we've seen young players with plenty of promise like Milos Raonic, Sasha Zverev and Dominic Thiem, but none of them have really been able to go too deep in a slam yet. Raonic made the final of Wimbledon last year, but none of them have really threatened the Big Four or the Big Four plus one with Stan, or even players like Marin Cilic or Kei Nishikori just yet. When do you think we will see one of these players make it to the quarterfinals or semi-finals of slams consistently and really start to threaten the Big Four?
Yeah, we were actually talking about that a bit earlier. I think it is interesting to think, why does it seem like a lot of the physical issues we're seeing more among these younger players? And I think if you think about that, and also just the trends that we're seeing in the age demographics of the top players, that you've got to attribute the playing style in this era of the sport to some extent to those changes, that the demands on stamina and endurance are just at such a high level now that I think it really makes it hard for those younger athletes to get to the later stages of the slam. And I think for those that have had some success, you're seeing that having had that experience appears to, have this physical toll that they're really maybe not totally prepared for. So it seems like, maybe there's a bit that the sport is still needing to learn in terms of how do we keep these players healthy when they're having to play, these kinds of endurance type of matches. I think based on, what we've seen the past decade, that it seems like, the late 20s is really where players are peaking. So for those athletes, that haven't gotten to that point yet, I think, there's still time to see really what they will be able to do. I don't think we've probably seen the most from them. And it's just a matter of avoiding, any major injury before they get to that point.
Yeah, and I think I would draw a distinction within the group you said, partially on age. Thiem and Zverev and Nick Kyrgios, your countrymen, are still in their young 20s. So I think we probably haven't seen yet what they're capable of. And to some extent, that's because of injuries, but also just because they probably haven't really come close to peaking. And I think there are concerns about each of the three of them and others we could name in terms of maybe surface preference and commitment to the sport and tendency to injury and other things and decision-making on the court. But it's also probably too soon. I think it is promising that Thiem has made 2 French Open semis, although he was blown out in both of them. But he's where I was really talking about surface preference, because he hasn't done much yet on the biggest stages on the other surfaces. Zverev and Kyrgios, I think, could play on all the surfaces, but there are other concerns. I think Zverev has overperformed out of slams than in slams, for instance, and there could be something like the best of 5 format, at least at his age. Raonic and I think Nishikori, even though you grouped him more in the group he's chasing, I think they are already approaching that peak age, or maybe at that peak age. And it could just be that they're great players, but they're not as great as the Big Four plus one. And if they were in maybe a different generation, they would have won a few majors by now, but they're not. And maybe they have reached their potential and it was just an off cycle for men's tennis. So I think partially because of the fact that we've seen more of them, so we have a better sense of what their peak is or what their near peak is, and partially because their age is closer to the Big Four plus one, so they won't have a big window where those 5 are declining and they're still at their peak. It's unlikely we'll see too many majors from them. I won't count anything out, having talked about the previous mispredictions. But with the young guys, I think because there is that sort of 10-year gap and more room for them to grow into their peak, one of them certainly could be number 1 for years and a 10 major winner. But, remember that 10 major winners are really aberrations. Some of the greats we think of in the 70s and 80s never got there. McEnroe, Connors, Lendl, Board, Edberg, Lendl. Really some of the all-time greats. None of them had more than 8 majors. So it could just be, Djokovic, Nadal, and Federer have really set such a high standard. And that's not the new norm. It's just those three, and we're not going to get to those levels again for a decade or so. And that'll really make us appreciate what they did and probably miss them enormously.
Lastly, whilst we're recording this interview in late July, it'll go up online just before the start of the US Open. It would be remiss of me if I didn't ask who your early favourites are for the men's and women's titles.
That's tough. We haven't really kicked off the U.S. hardcourt.
Right, we're going to sound
yet.
pretty dumb if the player's gotten injured and is out. So as long as you gave us that caveat, I think we can take that risk.
This is definitely bound to end in embarrassment, but it does seem like really on the men's side, who's going to challenge Roger. So I think I was disappointed with the men's final at Wimbledon. I thought if Cilic were totally healthy, that could have definitely been a closer match, and so I would still give Cilic a good chance. I think he could recover from a blister by then. So let's hope that he's in good form. Definitely, I guess I'd be interested to see some of the younger players we were just talking about get at least to the second week. I don't know about making a bid for the final this year, but hopefully getting to quarterfinal or semifinal would be good for the tour. I think some of the players obviously are going to be less favored on the harder courts. I felt like it was didn't get that much discussed, but I thought it was really heartbreaking what happened to Feliciano Lopez at Wimbledon to go so quickly after such an amazing warm-up run.
Winning Queens against Cilic.
Yeah, his first time. So, I would hope he would do well. I don't think it's probably as likely as it would have been on grass, but, it'd be good to see some of these guys that have really put in the hard work outside of the slams to get some recognition there. I think on the women's side, as it's been throughout the season, more open. I think some of the players like Joanna Konta probably, again, is going to have a harder time on a hard court than on grass. But I think she's quite consistent. I would expect her to do well. We're also going to have Kvitova and Azarenka. Again, they've both been doing way more than expectation considering the comebacks that they're having. And I think they have all of the potential to go far. It's just a matter of, if they're at that point in their comeback to really get deep into an event. And then we do have some of these younger players like an Ostapenko, making a bid maybe to become like a superstar in the tour. So I think it's kind of exciting just to watch their development, however far they get. I'm not making any, I guess, strong favorites. I'm just kind of putting all of the names in the mix. Well, you said Federer's the men's favorite. Pick one. Women's favorite on hard courts. Let's see. Well, I thought Muguruza was definitely impressive at Wimbledon. Don't know as a favorite. I guess maybe I'll give it for Kvitova maybe this will be the chance. I know she was many people's favorite for Wimbledon. I think maybe US Open will be the right time.
Cool. I agree with everything Stephanie said. I feel like it was notable some names she didn't mention. Although I will also pick Federer on the men's side, at least now, as the favorite. Nadal was potentially the second best hardcourt player so far this year. Made the Australian Open final, was very close to winning it. Made the Miami final. Maybe would have made the Indian Wells final if he weren't in the same 16th of the draw or 8th of the draw as, I guess 8th of the draw as Federer of Indian Wells. Made the final at Acapulco. Really had a good hardcourt season and then looked great on play and really looked great on grass until he ran into a really strong performance by Muller. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him in the final. They could go into that tournament ranked and seeded 1 and 2 and potentially meet in the final. They've never met at the US Open, so there'd be a lot of anticipation around that. Defending champ Stan Wawrinka has been basically a sure thing in recent years off of grass to make the later stages of majors, and he's often really dangerous when he does. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him make a run, even if he does nothing in Canada and Cincinnati. Andy Murray could go in, still ranked number 1, and he's won the U.S. Open. So I wouldn't count him out, although he's given no reason so far this year to see him as a favorite, which is bizarre for number 1. On the women's side, I think Kvitova, to me, is a stretch, just because she's never done well there, or really never played her best on hard courts, especially in the U.S. Whereas, the finalist last year who was supposed to winning, Pliskova, is number 1 now. She's my favorite, although a close second is the most consistent major player recently, Venus Williams. She's made 2 finals this year. She did well at the French Open, even though it's not her favorite surface. She's done well before at the U.S. Open. The crowds will be behind her like maybe they've never been before, especially without her sister in the mix. She'll be probably the top-ranked American woman going into that tournament. Some of the other top American women who are younger have actually had more injury problems despite her struggles with the fatigue-inducing syndrome. So I think that could be an amazing run, and it would be nice to see sort of the crowds buoy her into the later rounds. But yeah, at this early stage, without us really knowing anything about the top players' form on North American hard courts, Federer and Pliskova feel safe to me.
And I'll put myself out for embarrassment too. I can't look past Roger Federer on the men's side. And on the women's side, I'll go for Venus Williams. I think she'll go one step further than she could at the Australian Open, one step further than she could at Wimbledon, and that she'll take out the title on home soil. Thank you both very much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It was fun.
Thanks, Ed.